Let's talk about my experience with some cultural hurdles in Colombia. Hi all, I'm Ezrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. So in my last video I talked about some of the things I love about Colombian people, and today I thought I'd tackle the flip side of this by discussing some things that I found a little challenging to relate to culturally. Now, as I often do, I just wanted to start with some disclaimers. Firstly, these are my experiences, but I'm not saying that they'll necessarily be yours. Depending on the type of person you are and the culture you come from, you could have a totally different take to me, so just keep that in mind with everything I'm about to discuss. I should also say that it's not my intention to put down Colombian culture with any of this. Like, yeah, these were some cultural barriers I encountered, but I'm not criticizing or saying that anything ought to be different. I'm just pointing out some things that were fairly different from what I've grown up with in Australia, and therefore took me a little while to adjust to. Finally, just as I said in the previous video, nothing on this list applies to every single Colombian. These are generalizations, and whilst they still exist and can be widely observed, they're certainly not applicable to everyone. Anyway, that's enough preamble, let's get started. So, first thing I wanted to discuss is a quality I've seen in a lot of Colombian people, and that is the occasional lack of openness. Now, you might be a little confused hearing that, as typically when people think of Colombians, there's this image of very warm, welcoming, and embracive people, and this is absolutely true. What I'm referring to, though, shouldn't be misinterpreted as Colombians being cold or self-centered or anything like that. What I mean by lack of openness is that sometimes I found I could be hitting a wall in certain interactions that would inhibit me from going deeper with a person. Now, in my own country, I'm used to people comfortably diving headfirst into deep and personal conversational territory whenever it gets to that point. That's not to say that we wear our hearts on our sleeves, but just that we don't hold reservations to these kind of interactions when they're appropriately brought up. In Colombia, though, people's willingness to go deeper in an interaction often feels quite fickle, as it can change dramatically from moment to moment. Sometimes they can be readily vulnerable about their deepest feelings, desires, and hardships, and other times it can feel like they're really just not present at all. Ultimately, I think this inconsistency is what I find the most challenging. Like, if there was just a permanent aversion to getting too personal, well, then at least I'd know what to expect. But when it goes from being vulnerable and trusting to suddenly all but emotionally shutting one out, it can be a little jarring, and this is something I've experienced with several people. Here in Australia, if someone were to flip on you so suddenly like that, we're conditioned to think that we must have done or said something wrong, and now this person's distancing themselves from us. This can be the reason for it in Colombia too, but it's not always so easy to tell, as I've had several experiences where the person will then flip on me once again and go from what I interpret as formal and distant back to personal and very open without batting an eye. Now, it needs to be said, once again, this is not everyone, and in fact, in most interactions I've had, this doesn't usually happen, but it's happened enough times for me to recognize it as a thing with certain people in Colombia, especially considering I've never really experienced this in my own country at all, so, you know, make of that what you will. The next cultural barrier I wanted to bring up is pride and self-dignity. Now, I know at least with this one that I'm not the first to say this, and in fact I've heard a lot of Colombians even admitting it about themselves. Essentially, a lot of Colombians are very conscious of how they're perceived by others. That's not to say they necessarily have self-esteem issues or anything like that, but just that they're often very cautious about maintaining a standard they've set themselves when they're with their peers or out in public. Now, yes, this happens all over the world. I know I sometimes ponder how I'm perceived by others, and I'm sure you do too. In Colombia, though, I'd say that it's just a little more prevalent. Typically, it's not so much people showing off or trying to appear very cool or extravagant in front of each other, but more about how they choose not to act. They might have second thoughts about wearing a piece of clothing that's very mildly conspicuous out in public, or maybe they're overthinking how people will perceive a casual social media post they made. I've even noticed a strong stigma against losing your composure. I mean, don't get me wrong, by and large people do often display their emotions very outwardly in Colombia, but in certain settings, like in the workplace or when interacting with strangers, there can at times be real hesitance to engage in or even entertain drama and conflict. Just one example I could compare with my own country are the airline attendants. I remember the last time I was coming back to Australia from Colombia, I had a flight with both a Colombian airline and an Australian airline, and on both of those flights I remember there was a bit of drama among some of the passengers towards the airline about something. The response from the attendants though differed quite a bit between the airlines. On the Colombian plane, Avianca, the response was a lot more militant, as I could tell the attendants were very careful to maintain a strict and formal demeanour to exhibit a very stringent level of professionalism. On the Australian airline though, the attendants were more willing to quickly let go of this demeanour and engage with the passengers in a way that was a lot more casual, even if it ran the risk of being less professional. And it's in settings like this where I must say I do feel like I'm a bit more accustomed to the Australian approach, where getting more personal when needed is more commonplace. Anyway, in terms of how this whole thing of having pride and maintaining high standards came about, I think it's largely due to the fact that there are also a number of Colombians who don't live this way, and they've sort of created a stereotype that a lot of Colombians don't want to be associated with. If you look at street criminals, for instance, or even just a lot of the pushier beggars, not all of them, but the more persistent ones, you'll notice that these people are really less concerned with how they appear to you and more concerned with what you can do for them. Now, I could be shooting in the dark here, but I at least noticed that a lot of Colombian people are somewhat repulsed by this kind of behaviour and really don't want to be associated with it in any way themselves. Whether that's the reason for the pride and the high standards though, maybe partly, but I'm not going to make any concrete conclusions. Alright, moving on to cultural barrier number 3, extroversion. This is probably the most widely known point on this list, but Colombians can be very extroverted people. Once again, not everyone. I got plenty of Colombian friends who'd be on the more introverted side, but by and large, Colombia has a very vibrant extroverted culture. I must admit, in terms of being a cultural barrier, this one's a lot more personal to me, as personally I'm somewhat of an introvert. I like hanging out with friends in small groups and bonding with people on a deeper individual level, but I'm really not a big party animal and I don't have this level of hyper-energized, loquacious spirit that I carry into every interaction. To be fair, this never posed too much of an issue when I was hanging out with my Colombian friends, as, you know, I generally seek out friendships with people of whom I'm compatible, but when it came to more momentary interactions with strangers, this is where I was sometimes pushed out of my comfort zone. To go back to something I was alluding to earlier, probably the most common example of this uninhibited extroversion would be with street beggars and occasionally with street vendors. When it comes to these people in my own country, they're generally a lot less obtrusive, dare I say. A common thing you'll see in Sydney, for instance, is for beggars to just have a piece of cardboard explaining their situation and then a cup or a hat out for people to put cash into. As for street vendors, we really don't have a lot of them, but when we do, it's usually restricted to people selling artisan products, and the vendor lets their wares speak for themselves rather than giving any kind of sales pitch. Probably the most persistent people you'll see on the street here are charity workers, who can admittedly be quite pushy, but you don't encounter them too often. In Colombia, on the other hand, it can be a common occurrence to run into someone who's overly persistent with you. In some cases, even if you flat out ignore them or just say no, they'll keep following you until you become really stern about it, and even then, I found myself unable to escape these interactions on several occasions. It's just a level of forwardness I hadn't experienced much before, and it can take some time to get used to. Outside of being pursued on the street though, another area I found this extroversion was with the occasional Uber or taxi driver. There were times where they were just a little bit overbearing and chatty to the point where I was a bit overwhelmed. In fact, just generally speaking, even outside of transport, there were quite a few instances where I'd find myself with someone who'd just be incessantly monologuing to me, and since Spanish isn't my first language, I had to really focus hard to interpret them. So yeah, all in all, never had too much of an issue with friends, but when it comes to some of these other day-to-day interactions with strangers, the extroversion can be a little overwhelming at times. Also, some of the loud spruikers you find on the coast in particular can be a bit much when it's early in the morning, you know. Up next at number 4, let's talk about manners. Now, with this being a list of cultural barriers I had to adapt to, you might presume that I'm about to say that Colombians are ruder than what I'm used to or something to that effect, but in reality, it's the complete opposite. The real hurdle for me here is actually that Colombians can be very polite, even when you don't want them to be. One thing I noticed, for instance, is that a lot of Colombians are very hesitant to say no when being offered something or being asked to do something for fear of being too abrupt. Whilst this might not pose a problem to you if you're just interacting with a stranger that you'll never see again, when it comes to friends and people you want to bond with over a long period of time, that's a whole other kettle of fish. I know, at least for me, with these kinds of relationships, I want my friends to feel like they can say no to me when they want to. Moreover, if I was doing something that was bothering them, I'd want them to feel like they could talk with me about it. In Colombia though, there can be a real hesitancy at times to be non-compliant or to tackle any relational hurdles when needed. In other words, there's an aversion to getting involved in anything that could remotely result in relational conflict, at least until it builds up and becomes too much to bear. Until that happens though, it's much better to just maintain composure and not say too much. I think the reason for this largely goes back to the point I made earlier about pride and self-dignity in Colombia. Being quick to say no or directly confronting someone about a thing they did that bothered them can be considered taboo for many people due to how it can potentially make them look. People don't want to be perceived as an arrogant drama llama, so it's preferable to not rock the boat too much. As with some of the other entries on this list, this isn't something that's exclusive to Colombia per se. I mean, I think there are times for all of us when we try to avoid saying what we really think, but in Colombia, I just say the threshold of when to give in is a lot stricter than many countries, including my own. For this reason, it often pays to be perceptive with people in Colombia, as they mightn't always tell you what they truly think, which can make it tricky at times to form friendships and relationships on the bedrock of unreserved, open dialogue and sincerity. Finally, for the last cultural barrier, I've chosen something you may likely have heard about Colombians before, and that is tardiness. Simply put, punctuality and efficiency are not exactly highly esteemed cultural values in Colombia. You'll hear a lot of people talk about this, but it is something I can back up with my own experience as well. I've had several times where I've organized a hangout with someone and we agree on a time to meet up somewhere, but then when I go to the location at the arranged time, I'd be waiting for, in some cases, over an hour for them to arrive. Now, of course, this alone is already frustrating, but what's really aggravating is that most of the time when it's happened to me, the person's extremely obtuse about the whole situation. I seldom receive an apology from anyone for being late, and to be honest, a lot of the time I don't think it even registers with them as being an issue. Even if you conveyed your vexation about it, you'd probably just be met with confusion, as again, punctuality really isn't a value that comes intuitively to everyone as you might expect. I mean, I know for me, if I've arranged a time to meet up with someone somewhere, getting there on time becomes a priority for me. Whatever else I'm doing, I'll put that aside and do everything I can to make it on time. Now, I'm not perfect, and there have obviously been times where I've been late or have even had to change plans at the last minute, but the important thing is that when that happens, I'm extremely apologetic about it. I also try to prevent this from happening to begin with by having a good level of confidence that I can honor an arrangement before agreeing to it. Now, I think I'd be right in saying that most reasonable people in my country, and likely yours as well, hold these values to a point where it's virtually a given and taken for granted as something that everyone respects. When you go to Colombia, though, you'll likely soon realize, oh wait, this is an actual cultural value that's been instilled to me, not just something that's intuitive to everyone on the planet. Then the other side of this coin, as I mentioned, is the inefficiency. I don't really have much to add about this, it's much the same deal. Simply put, getting stuff done in a timely manner just isn't held as an utmost priority in a lot of cases. I think in a lot of the Western world, this is something we've become fixated on above everything else. Like, no matter what we're doing, the question is always, how do I make this more efficient and convenient? In Colombia, though, living in the moment is more the mantra of the land, so you'll often see people taking their time with things. If you're in a queue somewhere, for instance, and the person at the front is talking for ages to the service worker you're lining up for, those two people are basically living in their own world and are conscious of nothing else but that conversation, like the rest of the queue may as well be invisible. So yeah, in short, living in the moment is a value held much higher than punctuality and efficiency in Colombia. Anyway, that'll probably do us for this video. Hopefully I've been able to navigate this topic respectfully. You know, I think it's inevitable that whatever country you visit, you're always going to run into some things that are different from what you've grown up with and may take some time to adjust to, but that's okay. Again, that's not to say anyone's got it all backwards, just that we're different, and I don't think there's anything wrong in admitting that. As always though, thanks for watching this far. If you enjoyed this, feel free to like, subscribe, bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!